영어 동화 세상 리틀팍스.
Great Expectations, Chapter 1, A Man in the Churchyard. My father's family name was Pirrup, and my own first name was Philip. But all my young tongue could say of these names was Pip. So that is what I called myself, Pip. I never saw my father or mother or any pictures of them, for they lived before the days of photographs. I lived with my sister, who was more than 20 years older than I. My first vivid impression of things was gained one memorable late afternoon in the churchyard. At that time, I understood that my father and mother were dead, as were my 5 little brothers. Alone in this bleak place overgrown with nettles, I shivered with fear and began to cry.
"Stop your noise!"
cried a terrible voice as a man rose up from among the graves.
"Keep still or I'll cut your throat!"
He was a frightening man dressed all in gray with an iron on his leg like prisoners wore.
"Oh, don't cut my throat, sir!"
I pleaded in terror.
"Tell me your name, quick!"
"Pip, sir."
"Show me where you live. Point out the place."
We lived in the marsh country down by the river, 20 miles from the sea. I pointed to the flatlands where our village lay a mile or more from the church. After looking at me for a moment, the man turned me upside down and emptied my pockets. There was nothing in them but a piece of bread. When I was right side up again, I was seated on a high tombstone trembling while he ate the bread ravenously.
"Where's your mother?"
asked the man.
"There, sir."
I pointed to her tombstone.
"And is that your father alongside her?"
"Yes, sir."
"Who do you live with, supposing you're allowed to live, which I haven't made up my mind about?"
"My sister, sir. Mrs. Joe Gargery, wife of Joe Gargery, the blacksmith."
"Blacksmith, eh?"
And he looked down at his leg.
"Do you know what a file is?"
"Yes, sir,"
I said as the man tilted me back as far as he could to frighten me.
"You get me a file."
He tilted me again.
"And you get me food."
He tilted me yet again.
"You bring them both to me, or I'll rip your heart and liver out."
I was so frightened that I clung to him with both hands.
"If you would kindly please keep me upright, sir, perhaps I wouldn't be sick, and perhaps I could pay more attention."
He gave me a tremendous dip and roll.
"You bring me all that tomorrow morning. You do that and don't say a word to anyone that you've seen a person such as me, and you shall be allowed to live. You fail and your heart and liver shall be torn out and eaten. Now I'm not alone. There's a young man who hid with me, and in comparison with him I am an angel. It is with great difficulty that I am keeping that young man from harming you. Now what do you say?"
I said I would get him the file and what bits of food I could.
Good night, sir,"
I faltered. I watched as he limped away toward the low wall around the church. When I saw him turning to look at me, I ran as fast as I could toward home. But soon I looked over my shoulder. The marshes were just a long, black horizontal line then. On the edge of the river I could make out 2 things. One of these was the beacon by which the sailors steered, the other a gallows that had once held a pirate. The convict was limping toward the gallows as if he were the pirate come to life. Now I was frightened again and ran home without stopping. Joe's forge, where he did his blacksmith work, was attached to our house. When I arrived home, the forge was shut up and Joe was sitting alone in the kitchen.
"Mrs. Joe has been out a dozen times looking for you, Pip. And she's out now."
"Is she?"
"Yes, Pip, and what's worse, she's got Tickler with her."
Tickler was a piece of cane that my sister used to hit me.
"Here she comes,"
said Joe.
"Hide behind the door."
My sister threw open the door and, finding an obstruction behind it, pulled me out and used Tickler on me.
"Where have you been, you young monkey?"
"I've been to the churchyard."
"If it weren't for me, you'd have been to the churchyard long ago and stayed there. Who brought you up?"
"You did,"
I cried as I sat down on my stool by the fire.
"That's right, and I'd never do it again. It's bad enough to be a blacksmith's wife without being your mother."
She put Tickler away. Then she set to work making our tea and slicing and buttering bread for Joe and me. Although I was hungry, I dared not eat my slice. I had to save something for my dreadful acquaintance and his young friend, so I resolved to put my hunk of bread and butter down the leg of my trousers. Later, I managed to slip away and deposit the food in my bedroom upstairs. It was Christmas Eve, and for an hour I had to stir the pudding for the next day. Afterward, I sat near the fire taking a final warming before going to bed. A booming sound came from over the marshes.
Hark! What is that, Joe?
I asked.
A convict escaped last night, and they fired a warning. And now it appears they're firing warning of another.
Who's firing? Drat that boy,
said my sister, looking up from her needlework and frowning at me.
What a questioner he is. The firing comes from the prison ships across the marshes. I wonder who's put into prison ships and why they're put there,
I said. This was too much for my sister, who rapped me on the head with her thimble.
I didn't bring you up to bother everyone with questions. People are put in prison ships because they murder or rob or do all sorts of bad things. And they always begin by asking questions. Now go to bed.
I was never allowed a candle to light my way to bed. As I went upstairs in the dark, I thought how conveniently close the prison ships were for me because I was clearly on my way there. I had begun by asking questions, and now, because of the convict, I was going to rob Mrs. Joe. At the first light of day, I crept downstairs to the pantry. I stole some bread, some cheese, half a jar of mincemeat, some brandy, a bone with very little meat on it, and a beautiful pork pie. There was a door in the kitchen that led to Joe's forge. I unlocked it and got a file from among Joe's tools. Then I ran for the misty marshes. Great Expectations, Chapter 2, Chasing the Convicts. The mist was even heavier when I reached the marshes, carrying the things I'd stolen for the convict. Gates and cows seemed to burst out from the fog and cry, "A boy with somebody else's pork pie! Stop him!" I just crossed a ditch when I spotted the convict. He was asleep. I went forward quietly and touched him on the shoulder. He instantly jumped up, and I saw that it was not the same man. Yes, he was dressed all in gray and had a great iron on his leg, but his face was different. He swore and tried to hit me. Then he ran off into the mist, stumbling as he went, and I lost him.
It's the young man,
I thought, remembering how the first convict had told me about a dangerous younger companion. My heart full of fear, I ran on and soon found the right man. He didn't turn me upside down this time, but left me right side up while I opened my bundle. Then he was gobbling bread, cheese, and pork pie all at once, looking distrustfully into the mist every few minutes.
You brought no one with you?
He asked.
No, sir.
Well, I believe you.
The man took sharp, sudden bites just like a dog.
I'm glad you're enjoying it,
I said boldly.
Thank you, my boy, I am.
But I'm afraid you won't leave any food for him,
I added.
And there's no more where that came from.
Him? Who's him?
The young man who was hiding with you.
The man laughed.
He doesn't want any food.
I thought he looked as if he did.
The man stopped eating and regarded me with surprise.
You saw him? When?
Just now, when I found him and thought it was you.
He grabbed me by the collar.
Show me which way he went, and I'll hunt him down like a bloodhound. Give me that file, boy.
I pointed in the direction that the young man had gone, but the convict was down on the wet grass, filing away at his leg iron. I told him I must go. He took no notice, so I slipped away. When I reached home, I expected to find a constable in the kitchen waiting to arrest me. But there was no constable, and no one had even discovered my theft. My sister was busy getting the house ready for the festivities of the day. Joe crossed 2 fingers and secretly showed them to me, our sign that Mrs. Joe was in a bad temper. Mr. Wopsle, the church clerk, was dining with us, as well as Mr. Hubble, a wheelmaker, and his wife. Also invited was Mr. Pumblechook, Joe's uncle, who was a wealthy corn merchant in a nearby town. The dinner hour came, and the company came, and still there was no word about the food I'd stolen. Mr. Wopsle said grace, ending with the hope that we should be truly grateful. My sister stared at me and said in a low, reproachful voice,
Do you hear that? Be grateful.
Mr. Pumblechook added,
Especially be grateful, boy, to those who brought you up.
Mrs. Hubble wondered why the young were never grateful. Her husband solved the mystery by saying,
They're naturally vicious.
Everybody then murmured, True, and looked at me in a particularly unpleasant manner. Joe always comforted me when he could. He often did this at dinner by giving me gravy. Since there was plenty of gravy today, Joe spooned about half a pint onto my plate. All through dinner I clutched the table leg in fear that my theft would be discovered. Little by little I became calm enough to release my grasp and eat some pudding. I began to think I should survive the day when my sister announced,
To finish the meal, you must taste a delicious pork pie.
I clutched the table leg immediately. My sister went out to the pantry to get the pie, and I heard Joe say,
You shall have some, Pip.
I have never been certain whether I uttered a yell of terror out loud or merely in my mind. But I felt I could bear no more. I released the table leg and ran for my life. As I opened the door, I ran headfirst into a group of soldiers with muskets. A sergeant held out a pair of handcuffs to me, saying,
Here you are. Come on.
The appearance of soldiers on our doorstep caused everyone to rise from the table in confusion. Mrs. Joe, re-entering the room empty-handed, started to say something about the missing pie. But seeing the soldiers, she stopped and stared.
Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, said the sergeant. I'm on a chase in the name of the king, and I need the blacksmith. These handcuffs are broken.
Joe examined the handcuffs, and I began to realize they were not for me.
We're after 2 convicts, explained the sergeant as Joe took the handcuffs out to his forge. The men are thought to be on the marshes. Has anyone here seen them?
Everybody except me said no. Nobody thought to ask me. Everyone had forgotten about the pie. When Joe's job was done, he mustered the courage to propose that some of us go out with the soldiers. Mr. Pumblechook and Mr. Hubble declined, but Mr. Wopsle, Joe, and I were permitted to march behind the soldiers. As we entered the marshes, it began to sleet, so Joe put me on his back and carried me. Now that we were out in this dismal place, I began to wonder if my convict would think that I was the one who had brought the soldiers. Suddenly, we heard shouting. The soldiers ran like deer, and so did Joe. We soon came upon the 2 convicts fighting.
I captured him for you,
said my convict, the one I'd met first.
Here he is. He tried to murder me,
said the young convict.
I would have been a dead man if you had not shown up. He lies,
said my convict with fierce energy.
Do you see how his eyes wander and will not meet mine? That's how he looked when we were on trial together. Enough, said the sergeant.
He ordered a soldier to light the torches, and my convict caught sight of me. I tried to signal that I had not betrayed him. He stared at me, but I didn't know if he understood. We marched to the river. Suddenly, my convict spoke up.
I wish to say something regarding this escape. It may keep someone else from being under suspicion. I was starving and I took some food from the blacksmiths. We don't know what you've done, said Joe, but we wouldn't have you starve to death. Would we, Pip?
My convict turned away. By the light of the torches, we saw the black prison ship lying offshore. My convict was rowed out to the ship and taken on board. Then the torches were flung into the water and went out, as if it were all over for him. Great Expectations, Chapter 3, Meeting Miss Havisham. I often thought about telling Joe that I'd stolen the food, but I never did. He called us ever the best of friends. How could I disappoint him? One evening about a year later, we were sitting by the kitchen fire waiting for my sister to come home. She burst through the door with Joe's uncle, Mr. Pumblechook.
If this boy isn't grateful tonight, he'll never be,
she said excitedly.
Miss Havisham wants Pip to go play at her house.
Miss Havisham, who lives uptown?
Asked Joe.
Is there any other?
I'd heard that Miss Havisham was an immensely rich and grim lady who lived a secluded life in a large, dismal house barricaded against robbers.
Well, I wonder how she knows Pip,
said Joe.
Who said she knew him?
Answered my sister.
It's Uncle Pumblechook who made the arrangements. This boy's fortune may be made by going to Miss Havisham's.
Mr. Pumblechook beamed.
But here I am wasting time talking when Uncle Pumblechook is waiting, and this boy's filthy from head to toe.
My sister grabbed a tub of water and started scrubbing me. Then she dressed me in my tightest suit and sent me off with Mr. Pumblechook for the night.
God bless you, Pip,
cried Joe as we rode away. The next morning, Mr. Pumblechook took me to Miss Havisham's old brick house. Some of the windows had been sealed up, and those on the lower floor were covered with bars. While we waited at the gate, I saw there was a large abandoned brewery at the side of the house. A girl came across the courtyard and unlocked the gate.
"This," said Mr. Pumblechook, "is Pip."
Come in, Pip,
said the girl, who was very pretty and seemed quite haughty. Mr. Pumblechook was also coming in when she stopped him with the gate.
Oh,
She said,
did you wish to see Miss Havisham?
"If Miss Havisham wishes to see me,"
said Mr. Pumblechook.
Ah, but you see, she doesn't.
She said it in such a final way that Mr. Pumblechook could not protest. But he eyed me severely as if I had done something to him. I looked at the abandoned brewery as we crossed the courtyard.
Don't loiter, boy,
Snapped the girl. Though she called me boy, she was about my age. She was as scornful of me as if she were 21 and a queen. Since the great front entrance had 2 chains across it, we went into the house by a side door. The first thing I noticed was that the passages were all dark. The girl picked up a candle and led me upstairs to the door of a room.
Go in. After you, miss. Don't be ridiculous, boy. I'm not going in.
She walked away, taking the candle with her. I was half afraid, but I knocked on the door and a voice told me to enter. I found myself in a lady's dressing room well lit with candles. No glimpse of daylight was to be found, and in an armchair sat the strangest lady I have ever seen. She was dressed in rich white fabrics, satin, lace, and silk. In her hair she wore a wedding veil and flowers like a bride, but her hair was white. I saw that she hadn't quite finished dressing. Her handkerchief, gloves, some flowers, and a prayer book all lay in a heap on her dressing table. I also began to realize that everything that should have been white was now faded and yellow, and the bride had withered like the flowers.
"Come here," said Miss Havisham. "Let me look at you."
It was when I stood before her, avoiding her eyes, that I noticed her watch had stopped at 20 minutes to 9. A clock in the room had also stopped at that time.
"Look at me," she said. "You're not afraid of a woman who hasn't seen the sun for years?"
No, I lied.
"Do you know what I touch here?"
She laid her hands on her left side.
Your heart?
"Broken."
She uttered the word with a weird smile that had a kind of boast in it.
"I sometimes have strange fancies, and I have the strange fancy to see someone play. So play, play, play."
Nothing could have been harder for me at that moment. We stared at each other until she said,
"What's wrong? Are you stubborn?"
No, ma'am. I'm very sorry for you and sorry I can't play now. If you complain, I know I'll get in trouble with my sister. But it's so strange here, so melancholy.
"So strange to him," she muttered. "So familiar to me. So melancholy to us both. Call Estella."
I left the room to call the girl. She answered at last, and her light came along the passage like a star. Miss Havisham beckoned Estella to come near. She picked up a jewel from the table and held it against the girl's pretty brown hair.
"Yours one day, my dear, and you will use it well. Let me see you play cards with this boy."
With this boy? Why, he's a common laboring boy.
I thought I overheard Miss Havisham's answer, but it seemed so strange.
"Well, you can break his heart."
So we sat down to play cards, and I began to understand that everything in the room, like the watch and the clock, had stopped a long time ago. Miss Havisham sat as still as a corpse while we played.
What rough hands he has,
said Estella before our first game was over.
And what thick boots.
When I misdealt the cards in our next game, she called me a stupid, clumsy, laboring boy.
"She says many bad things about you," said Miss Havisham, "but you say nothing about her. What do you think of her?"
I didn't want to say it out loud, so I whispered in Miss Havisham's ear.
I think she's very haughty and very pretty and very insulting. I'd like to go home.
And never see her again, though she is so pretty?
I'm not sure about that, but I'd like to go home now.
Miss Havisham made us finish the game and told me to come back in a week. Then she told Estella to feed me. While I waited for her in the courtyard, I took the opportunity to look at my rough hands and thick boots. They had never troubled me before, but now they did. Estella returned with some food, which she handed to me as if I were a dog in disgrace. I was so humiliated and angry that tears came to my eyes. Estella looked at me with delight at almost making me cry. This gave me the power to control myself, but as soon as she left, I wept. When I recovered, I explored the abandoned brewery until I saw Estella coming to let me out of the courtyard. She opened the gate and stood holding it.
Why don't you cry?
She asked.
Because I don't want to. Yes, you do. You're almost crying now.
She laughed cruelly, pushed me out the gate, and shut it behind me.